Welcome back to the Thermo Diet Podcast. I'm your host, Jayton Miller, and I'm here with Mr. Georgi Dinkov, otherwise known as Hey Do. If you've been following any of Ray Pete's work or Danny Roddy's work, then you definitely know who this is. He is a man of much knowledge. So thanks for being on here, Georgi.
Thanks for the nice words. Let's find out if I'm a man of a lot of knowledge. Hopefully, your listeners think the same way.
Definitely. So the first thing that I kind of wanted to hop into was what exactly is endotoxin, and what are some of the best ways that we can get rid of endotoxin from harming the system?
So endotoxin is a component that's part of the wall surrounding and protecting so-called gram-negative bacteria. So these bacteria, most people carry them in their gut their whole lives, and they're typically much more difficult to treat with antibiotics. So you don't want an overgrowth with gram-negative bacteria, but so whenever you take antibiotics and it starts killing the bacteria, you may get this like endotoxin reaction, like a die-off. Some people call it like a die-off reaction. I think it's called a Hertzing, like a Hertzholt reaction or something like that. So sometimes you may get fever, right? You get indigestion, you feeling of malaise, nausea, that kind of thing. So those are some of the symptoms people sometimes get when they get antibiotics at higher doses, because they start to kill off those gram-negative bacteria in the gut. And when the bacteria dies and the cell wall ruptures, this endotoxin is released into the colon, and some of it may absorb through the colonic wall into the bloodstream. And the body views that endotoxin, which is also known as lipopolysaccharide or lipo-oligosaccharide, it views it as a sign of the presence of bacteria in the body, so the body mounts an immune reaction. So this is like a normal defense mechanism that the body mounts whenever it senses a significant number of endotoxin, significant amount in the bloodstream. Now, the problem is that the endotoxin is released from the bacteria not only when the bacteria die. So basically, you can get an endotoxin reaction anytime the bacteria gets a significant amount of food that basically allows the bacterial colony to grow. So every time, there's a constant turnover of bacteria, some of them die, others divide, right? And every time there's a division, a bacteria dies, or in general growth, the bacteria may shed some of this endotoxin. Not may, it does shed some of this endotoxin into the colon. Now, in most cases, for people with well-functioning gut barrier, this should not be much of a problem, because not much of this endotoxin gets absorbed. It stays in the colon. But even if it stays only in the colon, over time, if the colonic wall is constantly exposed to it, it can trigger a chronic inflammatory reaction. And now some people are saying that inflammatory bowel diseases such as Crohn's disease, ulcerative colitis, and all kinds of other inflammatory diseases of the gastrointestinal tract that are on the same spectrum. Now there is more and more recognition that a bacterial pathogen of some kind is involved. In fact, in some cases, in some countries in Western Europe, they now have an alternative protocol for treating Crohn's disease, and it doesn't involve immune suppression. It is a course. It's like a three-way combination of antibiotics, which you take at high doses for several months, and they're claiming a pretty good curative rate. And that's unheard of. Crohn's disease officially is an autoimmune disease. Most medical systems around the world will tell you it cannot be cured. The only hope is suppressing the immune system and keeping it suppressed. Yet more and more evidence is accumulating that all of these inflammatory autoimmune conditions are actually some sort of a chronic inflammatory reaction, which is contained in the name. They're called inflammatory bowel diseases. And endotoxin is really a very potent pro-inflammatory mediator, even if it stays only in the colon. Now, it becomes much more dangerous if the gut barrier is somehow compromised, and then a significant amount of this endotoxin ends up in the bloodstream. The first thing that it does is, through the portal vein system, which lines the gastrointestinal tract, this endotoxin will get carried to the liver. So the liver is overburdened every time it gets a dose of endotoxin, because you ate some kind of a, let's say, resistant starch food, which are very popular these days. in order to keep your blood sugar low. So every time you get some kind of undigested food to the colon or to any place of your gastrointestinal tract where this gram-negative bacteria resides, you're asking for trouble because it's going to start releasing endotoxin. Now, in a healthy person, not much will get into the bloodstream, but it may still over time trigger inflammatory reaction in the colon. But if you drink alcohol, if you're exposed to stress, which who isn't these days, right? If your diet isn't optimal, if you haven't slept well, if you're angry, any time you have a decline in metabolic function, this gut barrier is not like the great Chinese wall, which is built out of bricks. It actually depends on proper energetic function, proper functioning of the metabolism, because this wall is entirely functional. It depends on the proper functioning of the epithelial cells that line the colon. So if those cells are not functioning well, then they start their permeability increases, and they start accepting more and more of that endotoxin from the colon, and then they pass it on to the bloodstream, the portal vein system, and then it ends up in the liver. Now, the liver, if the liver is well functioning, well fed, you don't have fatty liver disease, hepatic steatohepatosis, also known as NASH, right? If you don't have cirrhosis, now the liver should be able to get rid of most of that endotoxin. Unfortunately, if you look at the statistics, up to 40 to 50% of Americans currently, and not just Americans, most people living on a so-called Western diet, they have a problem with their liver. They have some form of fatty liver disease. And the cases of cirrhosis, which is like the end stage, just actually the end stage is liver cancer, but really liver failure, which is also known as cirrhosis, those rates are rapidly increasing. So it looks like for a significant minority, if not even the majority of people, you don't want endotoxin to be reaching your liver because your liver is already in not very good shape. So anytime you give it endotoxin, you're burning it even more. Now, what's the problem with burning the liver? Well, the liver is the main detox organ that we have together with the kidneys. And another major function of the liver, which we'll cover the topic separately, but it's related to this one, is detoxifying estrogen. So look, there's a limited capacity the liver has for detoxification and excretion of endotoxin, estrogens, xenobiotics, endocrine disruptors, you name it. So every time you give it endotoxin, it has less capacity to detox all of these other problematic substances, including the estrogens, which we're going to talk about later. Not only that, but the liver expresses the receptor known as TLR4, toll-like receptor 4, which is the main receptor through which the endotoxin triggers the inflammatory reaction in the body. So the liver actually itself becomes inflamed every time you give it a dose of endotoxin. It is low-grade inflammation, but over time this adds up. And in fact, the low-grade inflammatory processes in the body are now known to be the major cause, if not the cause, of any kind of fibrosis. And cirrhosis, which is the end-stage liver disease, is a type of fibrosis. So over the years, even though you may be, you think your gut barrier is functioning well, the liver is functioning well, every time you give your liver a dose of endotoxin, you're increasing inflammation, and you're getting closer and closer to the fibrotic stage. Now, the liver, if it cannot actually cope with the endotoxin load, will release some of this endotoxin into the systemic circulation. And that's when you get, like, you're really asking for trouble, because in an immunocompromised person or a very sick person, very weak person with very few energetic resources, this can actually trigger so-called septic shock, and they can die out of multi-organ failure. In fact, septic shock is the major cause of death for hospitalized people, closely followed by doctors' errors, but still, sepsis is the number one cause for death in inpatient hospitalizations. So once it reaches the systemic circulation, even a little bit of endotoxin can cause a lot of damage, because it's allowed essentially access to all of these organs, and many of them express that TLR4 receptor. So any organ that expresses the TLR4 receptor will get into a state of low-grade inflammation, depending on how much endotoxin actually gets to the systemic circulation. If a person has a really poorly functioning liver, then the majority of the endotoxin will get to the systemic circulation. And I think those are the people that are dying of septic shock. In healthier people, you'll get this feeling of malaise. You may get fever, right? You may get a rash on your skin, unexplained rash. So in general, it's not a pleasant situation. And if it continues chronically, it can lead to the same fibrotic reactions in any organ that gets exposed to endotoxin for a significantly long period of time.
Now, do you know if the endotoxin is in a reductive state similar to a lot of the stress hormones?
Yeah, actually, the detoxification of endotoxin consumes a lot of NAD. So this means that if the NAD gets consumed, the end product will be NADH. So just having endotoxin in your system shifts rapidly the balance of the redox state towards reduction instead of oxidation. So it is a form of reductant, even if it's not a direct reductant. It gets to that point because it needs to be processed and excreted.
Hmm. So what are some of the ways that we can prevent the absorption of endotoxin and get it out of the system?
Well, I think a step even before that would be keeping the count, the overgrowth of the microbiome, keeping it in check. In other words, don't eat foods that get digested so slowly and so incompletely that they reach the colon mostly undigested. You don't want to be feeding your bacteria. The only thing that bacteria in your colon should be getting are things like insoluble fiber, because the insoluble fiber actually has an antibacterial effect and actually physically scrubs some of that biofilm of bacteria that has formed and is attached to the walls of the colon. This insoluble fiber can quite physically scrape it off and help you excrete it with the fecal mass. So the first thing is eating a decent amount of insoluble fiber every day. I'm sure your listeners have already heard of the recommendation to eat carrot salad, right? Cooked bamboo shoots, mushrooms are another great source. I personally prefer charcoal because charcoal, it actually can absorb endotoxin directly. So when you're eating the food and you're getting some charcoal with it, when it gets to the colon, even if there is undigested food and the bacteria starts literally chewing on it and releasing endotoxin, the charcoal will absorb most, if not all of it. So it will prevent that endotoxin causing issues even within the colon. So there will be very little, if any, left to even get to the bloodstream. We will actually first get to the liver and then get to the bloodstream. More importantly, or just as importantly, charcoal itself has a potent antibacterial effect, especially if it is combined with short to medium chain, actually with medium chain saturated fatty acids often found in coconut oil, lauric acid, caprylic acid, capric acid, undecanoic acid. All of these are found in coconut oil, and they're known to have an antibacterial effect. So in synergy with the charcoal, you can keep your colon fairly sterile, fairly clean, so that even if undigested food gets to it, not much endotoxin will be produced. And then once the endotoxin gets to your liver, the best things you can do for your liver is provide anti-inflammatory nutrients in the food that will also get to the liver and prevent some of the damage that the endotoxin is doing. Glycine, the amino acid glycine, the amino acid taurine, the amino acid proline. So in other words, eating gelatin, eating seafood that are very rich in these amino acids helps mitigate to a great degree the inflammatory reaction that endotoxin is going to cause in the liver. Aspirin, caffeine are also great anti-inflammatory substances, and they also happen to be anti-fibrotic as well. So even if endotoxin has already caused some damage in the liver over time, even starting late to taking these anti-inflammatory substances, you're giving the liver like a significant break. You're allowing the liver to recover because you either block the TLR receptor completely, or you negate some of the downstream inflammatory damage which comes from active-acting TLR4, which is the release of nitric oxide, the release of serotonin, the release of this inflammatory mediator called tumor necrosis factor alpha, TNF alpha. In fact, some of the most popular drugs for inflammatory bowel disease conditions right now are TNF alpha blockers, right? But they're just targeting one pathway. The things like gelatin, glycine, taurine, aspirin, caffeine, TLR antagonists such as Benadryl. Everybody knows that drug. It's marketed as a drug for allergies, but older studies in the 60s and 70s found that this drug can actually directly block the TLR4 receptor. So basically the idea, the preferable thing is to start as early as possible in the cascade, which is what the charcoal and the soluble fiber and the medium chain saturated fatty acids will do. Once it gets to the liver, then the goal should be controlling inflammation and supporting the liver as much as possible with nutrients, which means sufficient glycogen, which means carbs are very important, right? Because the liver consumes a lot of glycogen in trying to get rid of this endotoxin. So the anti-inflammatory substances, making sure glycogen stores are high, avoiding the polyunsaturated fats because they are actually precursors to the inflammatory mediators known as prostaglandins and leukotrienes. So if you're ingesting a lot of PUFA in your diet together with with ingredients that feed the bacteria. So in other words, if both PUFA and endotoxin make it to your liver, then it's a really like a much worse situation because endotoxin activates the enzymes cyclooxygenase and lipoxygenase, and those family of enzymes synthesize potent inflammatory mediators from the PUFA. So you're giving yourself like a double whammy of an inflammation attack by consuming PUFA and foods that feed off this endotoxin reaction. The drugs Benadryl, and the good thing about them is that they act not only on the liver, but systemically as well. And then anti-serotonin chemicals like cyproheptadine are also very important. Methylene blue, because it's probably the most potent anti-nitric oxide agent that we have as over-the-counter. It both neutralizes already existing nitric oxide in the blood and also inhibits its synthesis by reducing the expression of the enzyme known as iNOS, inducible nitric oxide synthase. And then in general, trying to keep stress low, trying to keep the gastrointestinal system supplied with sufficient blood, because anytime you get stressed out, the body shifts the bloodstream from less crucial organs such as your GI tract to organs such as the heart and the brain in order to basically keep you alive. But guess what? Every time you have a reduction in the blood flow, in a reduction in the supply of nutrients to the cells in the gastrointestinal tract, you're dramatically increasing the permeability of this gut barrier, and you're getting that much more endotoxin, supplied inside of your bloodstream.
So whenever it comes to the activated charcoal, is there a specific frequency that you typically recommend? Because the chelating properties of it tend to attract some of the minerals, don't they?
That's right. So I wouldn't use it every day. Now, if a person is having a very severe endotoxin reaction, has been going on for a while, I would consider using it daily on an empty stomach for a few days just to get that reaction to stop. And after that, I think 2 to 3 times weekly is probably sufficient because it has such powerful both antibacterial and endotoxin absorbing properties. So it should not be used every day because just like you said, it will chelate not just endotoxin, but just about anything else on its path. So yes. And in terms of dosages, I think for a very severe endotoxin reaction, 10 to 12 grams, which is 1 big tablespoon dissolved in maybe orange juice, and you can chug it with your orange juice. Or mixed with coconut oil and then chugging that mixture, as unpleasant tasting as it sounds. Actually, it's not that bad. I've tried it myself. But you do this for a few days, and after things are under control, then you go back to a more regular schedule of maybe like twice a week. I found that for me, twice a week actually works the best. 3 times a week, I start feeling symptoms of deficiency, such as my skin gets dry, which is usually a sign of vitamin A deficiency or zinc deficiency. So for me, twice a week works best. But for most people, the studies that have looked at animals, that have done animal models on the charcoal consumption, usually 2 to 3 times a week works best. Anything more than that, is only reserved for acute cases of like food poisoning, which is just another name usually for endotoxemia.
So you mentioned the relationship between endotoxin and serotonin, and by lowering endotoxin, you can lower the amount of serotonin that's being produced. What are some of the other ways that you can lower the amount of serotonin in the system?
So, because I don't know how many people, not many people know actually, but more than 90% of the serotonin is produced in your gastrointestinal tract. So, and the serotonin is produced every time the gastrointestinal tract is somehow either physically damaged, and you don't have to, by physical damage, I don't mean getting stabbed with a knife, just running intensely or jumping up and down for a significant amount, like for let's say more than 10 minutes, that stretching and that twisting and just in general, the shaking that occurs in the gastrointestinal tract, that alone, that mechanical stimulation is enough to trigger the enterochromaffin cells in your GI tract to start producing significant amounts of serotonin. So make sure you leave your GI tract alone, right? I mean, doing some crunches every once in a while is fine, but I found that crunches, if overdone, are a very, very reliable way of actually triggering a serotonin reaction. And what many of the listeners probably know of the expression, part of the expression is called runner's diarrhea. And because excessive serotonin leads to diarrhea, basically this immediately tells you that running for too long, which is known reliably to cause diarrhea, especially marathon runners, but you don't have to run 26 miles. Actually, it's been shown that anything more than 4 to 5 miles is already increasing serotonin levels enough to cause diarrhea. So basically, physically leaving your GI tract alone and not stressing it is a great way to prevent this 90% of serotonin being produced. Other ways that you can limit the production of serotonin is by limiting the supply of the precursor to serotonin, which is the amino acid tryptophan. And it's been demonstrated that when you consume tryptophan, first of all, you can select foods that have lower amounts of tryptophan. Muscle meats are very high on tryptophan. A lot of the legumes that people now tend to consume are also high on tryptophan and methionine, which synergizes with tryptophan and serotonin in a bad way. And also, these legumes tend to be the resistant starch types, and you're also feeding off endotoxin. So avoiding foods that are high in tryptophan is actually a good option. And if you cannot avoid those foods, then making sure you consume a significant amount or sufficient amount of either glycine. So gelatin actually tends to decrease the absorption of tryptophan from the food, which is a great way to limit just how much serotonin your body can produce, because if it doesn't have the raw materials, even if you're under stress, it will not be able to produce the serotonin, right? So gelatin is known to inhibit the absorption of tryptophan from the gastrointestinal tract. The branched chain amino acids, which are found in many bodybuilding products, many fitness products, but also in rich protein-rich foods such as milk, and especially cheeses, which is the casein portion of the milk. That's only the casein protein. First of all, they have a lower amount of tryptophan per gram than meats, but also they have higher amounts of the branched chain amino acids that actually inhibit the absorption of tryptophan from the GI tract. Aspirin is another tool. It has also been found to inhibit the absorption of tryptophan from the gut, and also polyphenols that are found in orange juice, such as apigenin, naringenin, bicalene. I think there's another one which is very similar. Ficetine. A lot of these flavonoids that are found in citrus juices are known to not only inhibit the absorption of tryptophan, but some of them are actually capable of even inhibiting the enzyme tryptophan hydroxylase, which synthesizes serotonin from tryptophan. Now, since I mentioned that enzyme, another great way to limit the production of serotonin is to inhibit that enzyme. And there are drugs that do that, but they're not widely available. But things like caffeine, the steroids, pregnenolone, progesterone, DHEA, testosterone, dihydrotestosterone. In fact, most androgens are known to be able to inhibit the enzyme tryptophan hydroxylase, and this probably explains to a great degree the fact that their potent antidepressant effects. Many people who abuse steroids abuse them not so much for the physique, for the effects on their physical composition and making them muscular, but because these steroids produce a very potent and rapid antidepressant effect. And I think that a large portion of that effect is due to the fact that these steroids inhibit the synthesis of serotonin from tryptophan.
Now, is there a way to inhibit the amount of serotonin receptors that we have in the system, or downregulate the amount of receptors that we have?
So you don't want to downregulate them, because this will be a signal for the body. Serotonin, if you actually get an injection of serotonin chronically, will downregulate those receptors. So what happens is that if you withdraw that amount of serotonin, the body will, as a compensatory mechanism, increase the production of serotonin, because the sensitivity of the receptors is low, right? You have less receptors, and the body thinks that, I need more serotonin in order to achieve the same effect. So what you actually want to do is increase the expression of the serotonin receptors, because then when you remove, and this is achieved by antagonists. So if you take the serotonin antagonist such as cyproheptadine, it will actually increase the expression of the serotonin receptors. It will make you more sensitive to the effects of serotonin. So when you stop the cyproheptadine, over the next 24 to 48 hours, your endogenous production of serotonin will dramatically decline. The body thinks that it has plenty, so it will downregulate actually the expression of the enzyme tryptophan hydroxylase, because it will basically think to itself, oh, I have plenty of serotonin, I don't need to produce more. So I'm actually not only going to limit the activity of the enzyme, I'm even going to reduce its production, because the tryptophan hydroxylase is just an enzyme like any other enzyme, and it gets produced by cells when needed. So the body will downregulate the expression of that enzyme, and you have higher sensitivity to serotonin, but low overall serotonin. And it's the presence of serotonin really that has the amount of serotonin you have in your body that is responsible for many of the chronic diseases. So you do want the situation of higher serotonin sensitivity, but low overall amount of serotonin in the body.
I see. So
Same thing happens with I'll just interject. It has now been found that drugs that antagonize the glucocorticoid receptor, which is the receptor for cortisol, are potent antidepressants. And they work by increasing the role of cortisol in depression is at this point very well known. Now, many doctors will say, well, it's really controversial. Yes, 2/3 of depression patients have high cortisol and are so-called non-suppressible because they have a special test called the dexamethasone suppression test. And what this test does is they give you a pretty hefty dosage of a very powerful synthetic cortisol, an analog known as dexamethasone. Now, what happens is that if your body has sufficient number of cortisol receptors, when it gets this hefty dosage of a synthetic glucocorticoid, the body will say, oh my God, I'm overloaded with cortisol. I'm going to turn off my own production of the endogenous cortisol. So in depressed people, this reaction actually does not happen because their endogenous cortisol levels are high and have been high for a long time, which means their cortisol receptors are downregulated. So when you give them this extra cortisol, the synthetic one on top, their body doesn't react the way it's supposed to be and says, I don't feel any different. So the cortisol levels in depressed patients will stay high when they actually are given this synthetic glucocorticoid. And 2/3 of depressed patients with clinical depression are so-called non-suppressible, non-responders of that test. And then they will follow up with a second dosage, which is even higher. And if you don't respond to that, then this is actually a pretty solid indication of a condition such as Cushing syndrome, which is the overproduction of cortisol due to a pituitary tumor or a tumor somewhere else in the body, usually the adrenal glands, right? But anyways, the role of cortisol in depression is very well established, and drugs that block these receptors, that act as antagonists, actually, you take them for a few weeks, right? And then when you stop, the body, unless you have a tumor somewhere overproducing cortisol, the body says, oh my God, I have all this cortisol floating around, and now my receptors are basically so sensitive. There's such a high density of these receptors, I'm going to tone down the production of cortisol. And the drug known as RU486, which is also used as an abortion pill, but is also a potent glucocorticoid antagonist, there are a number of studies showing rapid antidepressant effects within 24 to 48 hours after starting it, because its effects are increasing the sensitivity of the glucocorticoid system. The same thing happens when you take a serotonin antagonist. You increase the sensitivity of the serotonin system, and basically you tone down the production of cortisol and serotonin, which together are the major, if not the only, causes of depression.
So do you think that serotonin is almost aligned with the amount of stimulus that the biological organism has to compensate with? And so, for instance, like the psychedelics are serotonin antagonists, and we can bring in more stimulus into the system. Do you think that there is a direct relationship there?
Yeah, and I think the serotonin usually rises in response to stress. So the role of serotonin, it's a very ancient peptide, a very ancient neurotransmitter. By ancient, I mean it has been with us even when we were back in the stage of amoebas. If you look throughout the animal world, throughout the living world, even very primitive organisms produce serotonin. And the major role of serotonin in the organism, actually two of them that I'm concerned with. One is rapidly toning down metabolism. So in other words, when you're under stress, Serotonin is the mechanism through which the organism starts to conserve resources, right? If you're under stress, you don't want to be expending resources on things, on luxury things, quote unquote, from a biological point of view, such as reproduction, creativity, joy, right? Good mood, running around, playing around, feeling good, right? All of these things are considered non-essential. And when you're under stress, under some kind of a threat, it's the serotonin system, which is really the key to actually making the organism sort of like, go into a defense mode, and only keep its most vital functions. And serotonin is actually the primary regulator of the cortisol system, of the HPA axis. There used to be, and to this day, when you go to medical school, in the classes of endocrinology, you learn that the HPA axis consists of the hypothalamus, the pituitary, and the adrenal gland. But recently, actually, this knowledge has been around for a long time, but recently it's come center stage. It turned out that serotonin is actually a much more potent activator of the adrenal system directly, without even the involvement of the brain. It's a much more potent activator of the release of cortisol than even the peptide produced by the brain known as CRH, which was thought to be the initial step in the cascade of the stress response. It's still there, we still use it, but it turns out serotonin is actually a much more potent regulator. And now, actually, if you have Cushing syndrome, which is the disease of excessive cortisol production, which cannot be stopped, they found out that you can actually cure it by administering serotonin antagonists such as cyproheptadine. So basically, I think the role of serotonin is to tone down really the consciousness and the vitality of the organism when the organism is under threat. So if you're taking too many stimulants, I can totally see, actually, in fact, many of those stimulants have as a side effect an increase of serotonin. The drug ecstasy, it has a lot of potential for treating post-traumatic stress disorder, but it has to be used wisely and at not very high dosages, because in high dosages, it is a potent releaser of endogenous serotonin. And I think the reason this serotonin is released is kind of to like act as a brake on what the stimulant drug does to the brain.
Now, do you think there's a compensatory mechanism with MAO?
Yes, but basically for the MAO, there are two types, MAOA and MAOB. Older studies demonstrated that drugs that predominantly inhibit MAOB are potent antidepressants and actually can even treat Parkinson's disease, because MAOB preferentially degrades dopamine. MAOA degrades both dopamine and serotonin, but preferentially degrades serotonin. So in other words, if you're inhibiting MAOA, you will increase your amount of serotonin in the system, and dopamine as well, but to a higher degree. Epinephrine, because MAOA also degrades epinephrine, and serotonin, and these two are stress mediators. Now, I haven't seen any evidence if serotonin itself has an effect on the MAO system, but I wouldn't be surprised, because typically there are feedback mechanisms. So typically, if you have a high serotonin, initially it probably has a negative feedback mechanism, but being a stress mediators are known in extreme circumstances to flip that switch and make it a positive feedback mechanism. So I wouldn't be surprised if the levels are sufficiently high, if serotonin starts to inhibit MAOA, because there are cases of so-called serotonin syndrome, which can be triggered by excessive stress. And since the MAO system it's MAOA, the system is still there, and its role is to degrade serotonin. In order for it to be overwhelmed without the person taking any MAO inhibitor drugs exogenously, if this can happen solely based on stress, this means that your organism is capable of producing something internally that acts as an MAOA inhibitor. And my suspicion that something is serotonin when its levels reach when it reaches certain levels, like when it becomes too high.
Wow. Now, is there a relationship between serotonin and estrogen? And in the relationship, which one typically comes first?
Actually, there is a it's a bilateral relationship. Both of them stimulate each other's synthesis. Now, I mentioned progesterone being an inhibitor of the enzyme tryptophan hydroxylase, which synthesizes serotonin, right? Well, you would expect, if things work, logically, you expect something that acts the opposite way of estrogen, which is progesterone, which is estrogen in the body. you expect this to have an opposite effect. In other words, to activate tryptophan hydroxylase, and there are multiple studies published on that topic demonstrating that estrogen is one of the most potent endogenous inducers of the enzyme tryptophan hydroxylase. Conversely, serotonin is one of the most potent known inducers of the enzyme aromatase. So if you have more serotonin, you will be producing more estrogen. If you have more estrogen, you'll be producing even more serotonin. So it forms a positive feedback loop. And that's why many people find it so hard to break out of this vicious cycle of stress, of chronic stress, because often it's many more than one of the stress mediators that is elevated. So some people will say, oh, I'm taking, let's say, an aromatase inhibitor, and my estrogen is now low, but I still don't feel well. Well, because the estrogen ramped up the production of serotonin, nitric oxide, growth hormone, and a number of different mediators of stress. So it's like basically you kind of have to address all of them at the same time. In my experience, taking a serotonin antagonist actually tends to calm down the entire system, because it does seem like serotonin, being a more ancient hormone, a more ancient neurotransmitter, it has a higher role in the cascade of things in terms of controlling the overall health of the organism. So if you have to choose which one of the two you need to address first, I would probably go with serotonin, but they're both, promoting each other's effects and synthesis.
Now, saying that we are taking steps in order to decrease a lot of those stress hormones and those stress mechanisms, how can we increase or enhance our ability to synthesize the protective hormones?
So yes, so we already talked about keeping the level of serotonin low. I think you also had a topic to discuss, like keeping estrogen levels low, right? Mm-hmm. And they go hand in hand. So in general, you want to avoid eating foods that promote the synthesis of estrogen or contain estrogenic mediators themselves. There are a number of different flavonoids, many of them found in soy, such as genistein, daidzein, a number of different phenolic substances, the endocrine disruptors such as BPA, BPS, and many other found in plastics. They're all known as potent estrogen agonists. The daidzein and genistein and some of the other flavonoids are known as phytoestrogens, and some of them are even more potent than the endogenous estrogen we produce. The very popular supplement lately, resveratrol, is itself a very potent phytoestrogen. So some people are taking and say, oh, look, I take resveratrol, my estrogen levels go down. Of course they would, just like the test with the dexamethasone. If you give your body a potent estrogen agonist, the body will ramp down the endogenous production of its own estrogen, but it doesn't mean your estrogenic tone is declining. You are continuing to take this exogenous estrogenic substance, resveratrol, right? So avoiding as much as possible the consumption of polyunsaturated fats, because of their polyunsaturated nature, multiple older studies have found that fats are not just used as fuel, but they're also signaling substances. And the more unsaturated a fat is, the more it acts like estrogen, which is also a highly unsaturated steroid. And basically, the more it acts like estrogen, and it can synergize with estrogen, and the combination of a significant amount of PUFA with a very low amount of estrogen can give you an estrogenic response, which is equivalent to the one of somebody taking like a birth control pill, which contains synthetic estrogens. So making sure basically that you avoid the polyunsaturated fats as much as possible, and that includes fish oils. Now, if you look at the latest publications, mainstream medicine has kind of wisened up to the fact that unsaturated fats are not good, but they're saying, oh, guess what? This only applies to the omega-6 fats. The omega-3 fats are good for us, so we want to load up on the omega-3 and not so much on the omega-6. Well, they're all unsaturated, and they have all been shown to have estrogenic and pro-carcinogenic effects. Now, other things that can be done to limit the synthesis of estrogen is taking aromatase inhibitors. There are a number of different ones that are available over the counter, and some of them are some of them have been with us for centuries, if not even millennia. Some of the most potent ones include the fat-soluble vitamins. Vitamin E is a very potent estrogen receptor antagonist and aromatase inhibitor. Aspirin is capable of inhibiting the activity of the enzyme aromatase, because that enzyme gets activated when there's chronic inflammation. Yet another reason to keep endotoxin low. If endotoxin is a very potent and probably one of the primary mediators of inflammation in the body through the diet. We don't want endotoxin to be going high. Every time you activate an inflammatory system, aromatase gets activated as well. And the reason is that estrogen's role is basically a role of its role is of an acute state shock hormone, which basically also dramatically ramps down metabolism in cells and allows the cells to survive with much less energy than normal, but at the cost of dramatically reduced differentiation. So in other words, estrogen shifts your entire body, which is just a collection of cells. It shifts the state of these cells from highly differentiated cells that make you. Some cells are your ears, some cells are your skull, some other cells are your organs and body, right? And the estrogen shifts that state from well-differentiated thing that has the shape of a human back to a very amorphous mass that is just an aggregation of cells, and all these cells can do with the limited amount of energy they have is divide and grow, which is the process of cancer. So taking aromatase inhibitors and basically, keeping stress low, because every time you're under stress, the protective hormones such as DHEA and testosterone that males produce, DHEA is produced by both males and females. Testosterone is also produced by both sexes, but mostly by males. These are protective hormones, but they can convert into estrogen quite easily. So with age, it's known that males go from a high testosterone state to a high estrogen state, and for females from a high progesterone to a high estrogen state. And the reason is not only the increased aromatization, but estrogen itself stops the reaction through which the protective hormones are being synthesized, and those protective hormones are progesterone, pregnenolone, DHEA, and some of the derivatives of progesterone, such as allopregnanolone, which mostly works in the brain. It's a very potent GABA agonist. But estrogen basically limits the activity of the enzymes that synthesize these steroids. So what happens is over time, very little trickles down from cholesterol down the steroidogenic pathway. And because of estrogen and all of the stress and inflammatory mediators, the major pathway through which the steroidogenesis continues to go is through the estrogenic pathway, right? So whatever little hormones you produce with aging tends to be mostly estrogen. And some of the reasons for that are both the accumulation of PUFA in the body. Fat cells have a very high expression of the enzyme aromatase, and also the fact that PUFA itself is very estrogenic as well. It activates the enzyme aromatase, and it creates this state of chronic stress. And as we said, the role of estrogen is the role of a stress hormone. So every time you're under stress, all the stress mediators will increase in response. And if you're under constant stress, they will stay high. So there will not be much chance of the body to produce the protective steroids, which necessitates in some people using these protective steroids exogenously as a supplement. Pregnenolone is probably one of the safest because it's so high up in the steroidogenic chain. There isn't much of a chance, if any, of it converting into estrogen, unless somebody has a true estrogen deficiency, in which case there may be some conversion into estrogen, but only as needed. In general, pregnenolone itself has an anti-estrogenic effects. I'm sure you've seen some of the studies I've posted. It is a mild aromatase inhibitor compared to some other steroids, such as progesterone. And it happens to be relatively benign regardless of the sex or age of the person taking it. It seems to only work if the person has a true deficiency or excess of some hormone somewhere, in which case pregnenolone tends to balance out the whole system. Progesterone is considered by medicine as a true hormone because it actually attaches to a receptor known as the progesterone receptor. In contrast, there is no such receptor known for pregnenolone. So pregnenolone is treated strictly as a precursor, but there are receptors through which pregnenolone attaches and works, but progesterone is considered a much more classic hormone because it has its own receptor. Progesterone is a potent aromatase inhibitor and a potent estrogen receptor antagonist. And even functionally, it tends to oppose many of the non-genomic effects, non-receptor effects that estrogen has. Case in point, estrogen increases the activity of the enzyme tryptophan hydroxylase. Progesterone decreases it. Estrogen activates the HPA axis and increases the release of the hormone ACTH by the pituitary, which triggers the production of cortisol by the adrenals. Progesterone reduces the synthesis of that steroid. Progesterone is also an antagonist of the glucocorticoid receptor. So it seems to be able to sort of like affect three systems just by one, right? So it decreases the synthesis of serotonin. It's known that in high doses, it can actually block the serotonin receptor 3, which is mostly expressed in the gastrointestinal tract, 5-HT3, but it's also expressed in the brain and other organs. And antagonists of 5-HT3 are now used not only as treatment for nausea, but now there's indication they may be able to treat mental health disorders, neurological diseases such as Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, etc. Long story short, progesterone seems to both decrease synthesis of serotonin and oppose some of its effects. So it also is known to decrease the synthesis of estrogen and oppose directly its effects through the receptors and also functionally. And it's also known to, despite being a precursor to cortisol, progesterone is also known to decrease the levels of cortisol because it inhibits the enzyme that synthesizes cortisol and also simultaneously increases the enzyme that degrades cortisol. And if that wasn't enough, progesterone is also a direct antagonist of the cortisol receptor. So that's why some people, especially in a highly stressed state of chronic stress, or it's a acute state of very, very severe stress, they find that supplementing with these steroids, pregnenolone, progesterone, and a little bit of DHEA to be highly beneficial. DHEA itself has a number of different good pro-metabolic effects. However, it needs to be used carefully because, as I mentioned earlier, under stress, it very easily can convert into estrogen.
So typically, I see the DHEA and progesterone supplementation mix together. Is there a specific reason that those are together? And could you also supplement that with pregnenolone to have that go down the more protective hormone pathway?
Yes. So if you're supplementing with the DHA and progesterone together, you're getting most of the benefits because pregnenolone can only go down two pathways, progesterone or DHA. So if you're taking already the top levels of these two pathways, the androgenic one and the progestogenic one, right? If you're taking progesterone and DHA, you're already getting most of the benefits of pregnenolone. But pregnenolone lately has been found to have a very interesting effects of its own that are not completely overlapping with progesterone and DHEA. One of those effects is potent blockade of the cannabinoid receptor. And activation of the cannabinoid receptor by smoking marijuana has been, which is responsible for giving people the high of smoking weed. But also that cannabinoid receptor has a darker side. It's known to be overexpressed in cancer and a number of different mental and neurological disorders. And it's known that antagonists to that receptor are capable of not only blocking the high of marijuana, but also reverting the psychotic state which can come from abusing weed, for smoking too much marijuana. And also now lately it's been shown that antagonists of the cannabinoid receptor family may be capable of treating post-traumatic stress disorder, may be capable of treating chronic anxiety, states of anxiety, may be capable of treating addiction disorders, if you believe there is addiction, especially addiction to hard drugs. So pregnenolone seems to have a very potent effect on that CB family of receptors, cannabinoid receptors. And pregnenolone has some of those, but according to the studies that I've seen, it's not nearly as potent. So if you're taking progesterone and DHA in terms of steroidogenesis and taking care of the pathways that are further down from these two steroids, I think you're covering all the bases. I mean, they'll convert into whatever is necessary. And having a ratio of progesterone to DHA of at least 3-to-1, it will protect DHA from converting into estrogen because it is down on the pathway, right? So if the enzyme aromatase is inhibited, then DHA can only convert, either stay as DHA or convert to testosterone or dihydrotestosterone, which are other very highly beneficial steroids, especially for males. So that's what the combination of DHA and progesterone gives you. And then you can if you're prone to synthesizing more estrogen, if you have excess weight or you're at advanced age, right, or you have some kind of a chronic disease, which absolutely guarantees you that the expression of aromatase will be high and your estrogen levels will be high, at least in the tissues, then having a higher ratio of 3-to-1 may be even desirable. Maybe 5-to-1, 8-to-1, up to 10-to-1 has been experimented with, and the results seem pretty good. And the combination of having a little bit of DHA with progesterone prevents the anti-androgenic effects which progesterone tends to have in very high doses when given to men. For women, it's probably not that big of a deal. They can take very high dose of progesterone by itself and not experience much ill effects. But progesterone itself, when used in too high doses in males, may have anti-libido and anti-androgenic effects, which obviously males would not want that. And seems to based on experiments, that adding just a little bit of DHEA seems to control for those effects, and if not completely prevent them.
Wow. So, what other topics are you on fire about right now? Is there something specific that you're kind of looking into or interested in?
Yeah, I'm not sure if you've seen. I mentioned on the forum that I basically the repeat forum that I now do my own studies. I work with two labs, one in Taiwan and one in Bulgaria. I'm originally from Bulgaria, but I live in the United States. I've been here half my life, so I guess I'm half and half at this point, as they say. But I still have contacts back in Bulgaria, classmates and other people who went into, they have a career as scientists. So I reached out to them and said, hey, look, I want to do my own animal studies, both with our own products and new things that we'll synthesize. So I also got in contact with chemists. So now we're synthesizing some interesting new chemicals, some of them based on steroids, some of them based on, the idea of the fatty acid oxidation inhibitor. There is a drug known as mildronate, also known as meldonium, which is used to inhibit the oxidation of fatty acids. And that process is known to be highly protective. It was designed as treatment for cardiovascular disease. But at this point, more and more studies are coming out and saying, look, if you inhibit the excessive oxidation of fats, you may actually be able to cure for good diseases such as cancer, Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson, and whatnot, because they all seem to be metabolic in origin. And they all seem to have this excessive oxidation of fat at their base. And what does oxidizing fat has to do with disease? It is the ultimate stress signal. And that's basically under stress, the cell switches from oxidizing glucose to oxidizing fat under the command/influence of these stress mediators that we mentioned: estrogen, serotonin, prolactin, growth hormone, cortisol. All of them have the effect of turning off glucose oxidation in favor of fat oxidation, because the fat oxidation, you actually have sufficient stores of fat, and that's what happens when the organism is under threat and needs to survive. It switches from the fuel, which is in short supply, which tends to be glucose, right? Because you have to eat it from the diet. You cannot store more than a kilo of it. Most of it in the liver and muscles, right? And then, but we do tend to have plenty of fat. So the stress mediators switch on the oxidation of fat, and that seems to be the signal for the development of virtually every chronic disease known to men. Very classically, diabetes. Now more so it's starting to become recognized in cardiovascular disease. And lately, very recently, now a lot of new studies have come out saying, wait a minute, we're seeing the dramatic increase of oxidation of fat, and conversely, suppressed oxidation of glucose in infectious disease, in cancer, in Alzheimer's disease, in Parkinson, in diseases like amyotrophic lateral sclerosis that are wasting diseases, very similar to cancer, and even in HIV. So we're looking at synthesizing other molecules that can inhibit the fatty acid oxidation much more effectively than mildronate can, and we're testing those in animal models. So that's my work. That's most of my work outside of my day job, which actually happens to be in IT.
Okay, interesting. And what does that look like?
In the IT sector, or I'm basically in the IT security sector. So I'm kind of like a hacker for hire for the government as a contractor. They just hire me to try to break into their computers, and if I succeed, I write a report saying this is what you need to do to fix it, so that other people wearing the politically incorrect black hats, they don't do the same without telling you. So I'm a white hat hacker. And then, they hire me before the black hat hackers come in and do their nefarious things.
Awesome. Well, Georgi, I really appreciate your time. Thank you for hopping on here. I think the listeners are going to love this. So I appreciate it.
Thanks a lot, man. Thanks for inviting me. Hopefully it's useful to your listeners.
Definitely. And if you haven't already, make sure to go check out Georgi's work. It's absolutely amazing. Haidut.me. That's HAIDUT.me. Phenomenal website, amazing blogs. And then you're also under Hate It on the Repeat forums. And you have a whole host of different podcasts and stuff that you're guests on. The Danny Roddy podcast on YouTube is also a really good one. So make sure
simply search in Google for Haydut will usually come up mostly with results related to stuff that I've posted or said or done.
Sounds good. Heck yeah.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Definitely. Thanks for listening, and I'll talk to you next time.